From the beginnings of time, man has told stories. Among his favorites are of the unexplained. Arthur C. Clarke once said, "There exist two possibilities. Either we are alone in the universe, or we are not. Either is equally terrifying. Only a fool discounts as impossible that which falls outside his experience. And thus, we have tales from beyond the veil." 5 times the unobtrusive man stepped into the swirling night in London. 5 times he talked to women of the streets. Each time the woman died, slashed in a style that was the bloody trademark of the man called Jack the Ripper. Dozens and dozens of detectives, amateur and professional, have advanced theories as to who the little man was. No one has ever finally settled the question. His brutal crimes remain baffling, fascinating, and unsolved, nearly a century and a half after he committed them. The East End of Victorian London, in the year 1888, was a festering sore on the face of London. In the area called Whitehall, small houses huddled along the sides of streets that stank of refuse. At night, the alleys, yards, and corners were black caverns beyond the candlelit windows. Indoors, an overcrowded population fought for elbow room in the hovels. Outside, men, women, and children scratched a miserable and often criminal living in the streets. The only relief was oblivion, which could be found in a bottle of gin for a few pennies. For many women, prostitution was the only means of making a living. Jack the Ripper stepped into this cauldron of human misery in the autumn of 1888. Fear and panic came with him. Mary Ann Nichols was down on her luck. At 42, she was getting too old to attract men. She could not even raise the 4 pennies demanded by rooming houses for a bed. The little money she possessed had already been spent on gin. When a man approached her in the narrow street, Mary saw only the chance to make enough money to enjoy a good night's sleep. Even when she drew her back into the shadows, she was not alarmed. There were people just a few yards away. By the time she realized anything was wrong, it was too late. The Ripper stepped behind her, put his hand over her mouth, then he cut her throat. A trucker found her mutilated body in the early hours on Friday morning, August 31st, 1888. The Ripper's reign of terror had begun. He waited exactly 7 days before he struck again. The victim was, as all of them were to be, a prostitute. 47-year-old Annie Chapman. Dark Annie, as she was known, was dying of consumption, a wasting disease of the lung. When the Ripper cut her down, her body was found by a workman in a backyard. Her rings and a few coins had been laid out neatly at her feet. By the sickening remains of her corpse, she had been completely disemboweled. By now, the area was aflame with rumors. One story had it that the killer carried his knives in a little black bag. Riots broke out as hysterical crowds chased anyone who carried such a bag. Vigilante groups were formed to patrol the streets. The police arrested dozens of innocent suspects. But the Ripper had left no clues. All the police doctors could deduce was that he was left-handed, and he had some medical knowledge. The killings, said an inquest surgeon, had been deftly and fairly skillfully performed. On the night of September 30th, the Ripper butchered 2 more women and left what may be the only direct clue of his grisly career. Long Elizabeth Stride, was found with blood still pouring from her throat. And the body of Kate Ellos, the most terribly mutilated of all, lay a few minutes' walk away. From her hacked body, a trail of blood led to a doorway where someone had scrawled in chalk, "The Jews are not the men to be blamed for nothing." Did it mean that the Ripper was a Jew out for revenge on a world that had persecuted him? Or was he a crazed judge who had become his own executioner? The real meaning of the message, whatever it was, could have been vital. But it was never properly studied, for mysteriously, inexplicably, the head of police, Sir Charles Warren, ordered it be rubbed out. The whole of London was gripped by the horror of the double murders. Rumors flew. The Ripper was a mad doctor, a Polish wild man, a Russian czarist secret agent trying to discredit the police, a Puritan obsessed by the city's vice. It was even suggested that Jack the Ripper was an insane midwife with a murderous hatred for prostitution. No one knew. The real Ripper remained at large, and on November 9th, he struck again. The last person, apart from the killer, to see 25-year-old Mary Kelly alive was a passerby named George Hutchison. She asked him for money to help pay the rent for her tiny room. Then he watched her move off to accost a small, well-dressed man with a fair mustache and a deerstalker hat. Her dismembered corpse was discovered the next morning in her room. Mary was the Ripper's last victim. He never went back to his gruesome business. Detectives have tried to follow his trail ever since, but with no conclusive results. Police files on the case have been locked away in Scotland Yard, and they weren't released until 1992. And even then, they contained only speculation. For the Ripper left few tracks. Each time he killed, he simply vanished back into the seething crowds. How? If he was a poor man, how did he acquire the medical knowledge to carry out his fiendish surgery? If he was wealthy, why was he not noticed amidst the East End's abject poverty? And how could he have worked unnoticed when surgeons of the time estimate that his terrible operations would have taken up to an hour to perform? The questions are still unanswered. The police closed their file on the case only a few months after Mary Kelly's death. And although others have raked over the trail since then, their conclusions have always been guesswork. The most likely theory of the Ripper's identity seems to be that put forward by the author and broadcaster Daniel Farson. He based his research on the notes of Sir Melville Macnaghten, who joined Scotland Yard the year after the killings and became the head of the Criminal Investigation Department in 1903. According to Macnaghten, the police had concentrated on 3 suspects: a homicidal Russian doctor named Michael Ostrog, a woman-hating Polish Jew named Kaminsky, and a depraved lawyer named Montague John Druitt. In the end, they decided Druitt was the killer. Parson, after years of research into Druitt's family, agrees. He says that Druitt's family believed him to be the Ripper, and he points out that his cousin, Dr. Lionel Druitt, had an office only a 10-minute walk from the furthest of the murder sites. Druitt's mother, Parson adds, was insane, and Druitt may have feared he was going mad as well. Druitt was never arrested. He disappeared soon after the last murder. His body was found floating in the Thames 7 weeks later, on December 31st, 1888. Did Druitt commit suicide, or could he too have been a murder victim? If Druitt really was the butcher, it would have been poetic justice. Only one man ever knew the truth of it all, Jack the Ripper himself. But whoever he was, his dreadful secret has been buried forever.